So thank you everyone for coming to another Reltio Community show. And this one's called Enhancing Data Integration, Address Cleansing Techniques with Reltio Integration Hub. And so Dan Gage, he's a Principal Solutions Consultant here at Reltio. So Dan, welcome back.
Thanks, Chris.
You're welcome. So the rules of the show, keep yourself on mute. All questions should be asked in the chat, or you can take yourself off mute and ask there. As usual, these are recorded and posted to the Reltio community, and I will send the follow-up to everyone that attended and registered. Next slide. And as usual, we have a jam-packed summer full of community shows and one or two that I still haven't even pushed out to the community yet. But today's show is Enhancing Data Integration with Reltio Integration Hub. And then we have two more shows specifically around Reltio Integration Hub as well next week, and then the following week. And then we have a show around, if you're a life sciences company, you'll be very interested in this one, patient centricity, a pharma industry trend defining new ways of patient data management. And then on July 9th, we are very excited to show that we've got a new kind of product called Reltio Business Critical Edition. So it's enhanced security and resilience. More to come on that. And then on the 11th, really excited to show a new kind of integration with Reltio Data Pipeline for Databricks. That's really exciting. And then one on improved data discovery with Reltio integration for Calibra. That should be really exciting. If you haven't signed up for those, please do. Next slide. I'll post this in the chat, but we have a conference coming up called Data Driven 2024, and feel free to scan that and you'll get these slides as well. And then I can get you $200 off since you're part of the community, just put in the community code on there, and then I'll put the information there in the chat. These are all the customers or companies that are presenting as of now. Really excited. And that's all I have, Dan.
Hey, thanks, Chris. So what we're going to be focusing on today is primarily around address cleansing. So the idea is when you have data that is brought into Reltio, Reltio is going to automatically cleanse and standardize that data using the default configuration within the Reltio cleanser. But your existing license also entitles you for the opportunity to take that external data, and if you choose to not load that data into Reltio, but instead to leverage that address cleansing service, you can just leverage those APIs, and we're going to go through a couple of different techniques on that today to bring that data into Reltio service, to cleanse and standardize it, and then bring it back to your source via those APIs. And a couple of things we'll talk about is Locate. So the Reltio address cleansing service is powered by Locate behind the scenes. So that's something that for any of you that weren't aware of that, it's completely transparent to you. Reltio maintains and operates that instance of Locate. Again, it's typically included as part of your license, whether you're using US-based records or international records. Your entitlements, you can certainly work with your customer success team if you have any questions about what regions you're entitled to, but all US-based data would be included by default for all customers. You can also leverage as part of your testing process that we're going to talk about today. There is a public website here, support.locate.com, that will allow you to go through and test the Locate service outside of Reltio. So if you're getting results that are inconsistent with what you're seeing in Reltio, you've got some techniques there that you can test the default configurations, and we'll look at that. So what we're going to focus on today is configuring the address cleanser. And what you're going to do is you have the ability to have multiple different, what we call cleanse configurations within your Reltio tenant that gives you the ability to have different thresholds that are leveraged. So again, there's a default configuration that's typically used when data is brought into Reltio. But when you're leveraging the APIs, you explicitly have the opportunity to tell Reltio, I want to cleanse this record via an alternate configuration, which uses different parameters, different thresholds, different mappings. And again, we'll go through some examples of that here shortly. The testing can be done directly through the Reltio console. So as you configure the Reltio cleanser to leverage your specific parameters, the Locate service is still being used behind the scenes, but those parameters will be passed into that service. And again, you can do that directly through the Reltio UI. That service, of course, is going to be available via an API. So you can also test that with tools like Postman We're going to go through a process today where we're going to use the Reltio Integration Hub to take an external file. In our scenario, we're going to grab that file from an SFTP site. We're going to pull it in. We're going to cleanse it. And for demonstration purposes, we're just going to show you the results inside Reltio Integration Hub, but you can certainly append that data to the original source file or write it out to a new file based upon your business needs. And then you also have the ability to leverage those APIs through scripting tools like Bash or Python. And we'll show you an example of that today. So we're going to show you the results as part of our community deliverables. We will provide you the Reltio Integration Hub recipe as well as the Bash recipe that we're going to use here today. But again, I would emphasize that the Reltio Integration Hub is a tool that Reltio provides. Scripting tools like Bash or Python are something that would be supported by your organization. So we would provide the API services and ensure that they're working correctly, but it would be up to your organization to decide how you do that scripting. So I will provide the example here today, but that's purely for guidance and direction. So looking at that cleanse service. So first thing that we're going to point out is configuration of the Reltio address cleanser is done through the JSON here today. So while there's a wide variety of configuration options that can be done directly through the Reltio console, such as adding attributes or defining match rules, the Reltio address cleanser is something that still requires you to do your base configuration in the JSON file itself. And you would access that by going into your Reltio console data modeler. And you'll see there's two options on the left for you to download the configuration, which will allow you to bring that JSON out of Reltio where you can tweak and change any of the configuration options, and then to import that configuration back into the instance. And here at the bottom of the screen, we've got a link that's going to highlight the base cleansing services and the general parameters that are available. So we'll go into some specific examples here around defining some input mapping and some optional parameters. But again, all of that is going to be fully documented through that link on the Reltio documentation site. So the first thing we'll talk about is the service that Locate provides has default parameters that Locate can support for both inputting the data that you're choosing to cleanse, as well as the data that's returned. But your default things that you would certainly expect is to have the cleansed and standardized version of the address, city, state, zip. But there's also additional parameters that can be brought back to enrich that record. So things like latitude, longitude, geocoding. Reltio also supports the ability to return a time zone, to return census data with regards to a congressional district or demographic data for the regional territory based upon that census evaluation. And then if you're leveraging services like CAS, which is the U.S. Postal Service for Advanced Address Cleansing, you also have additional fields like residential delivery indicator that can be optionally provided if you're leveraging the CAS subscription. So what we're focusing on is the ability that you're mapping data from your existing tenant. So you can see here the attribute URI that's indicating where data is coming from inside the Reltio tenant when a record is created, and where the output is going to go is going to come from with the Locate service. So there's some Locate parameters like delivery address 1, delivery address 2, time zone name. Those are the pieces of information that are going to come back from Locate. And this output mapping is going to allow you to define a default set of mappings between the Locate data and where you want to put that data in Reltio. So if you're leveraging the Reltio velocity packs, you're going to have these cleansers are going to be predefined. But in the case where you may choose to use an alternate address structure, or if you create a new entity type that you wish to do cleansing on, then the ability to use these output mapping files is very important. So one of the things I want to focus on here is the idea that within the cleanse configuration, you can define a global mapping. So in this case, I've called it mapping 1, and it's an output mapping. And when I go to the next screen here, what you're going to see is you have the ability when you're creating a specific cleanse configuration. In this case, this one's called default. And you see the name that's highlighted in red here becomes very important because when you're leveraging those APIs, you're going to want to explicitly tell Reltio which cleanse configuration to use when cleansing the data that you're providing. And you see here at the bottom in the mapping, the input mapping is explicitly being defined that data is going to come in via a field called address input, and it's going to be passed to the Locate parameter address. A value is going to come from the country field and be passed to the Locate field country. And you'll notice the mandatory and parameter for the address input is set to true, which means that this cleanse config will only be executed if an address input is provided. If no address input is provided, then this cleanse configuration will be effectively skipped because it is a mandatory parameter. However, country is not a mandatory parameter. So if it's not provided, Locate will make its best effort to estimate the country based upon a couple different things. So you have the ability, you're going to see in the next screen, where you could set a default country, but Locate will also attempt to parse that country from the address input. One last thing to point out here is the idea that you're chaining together these cleanse configurations. So in your Reltio cleanse config, your configurations are in a sequence that's a chain of the different cleanse configurations that can be looped together. And then you'll see this parameters here. It says proceed on success or proceed on failure. So where you define multiple cleanse configurations, you have the ability to indicate whether or not it's going to leverage the first configuration. And if that first configuration does not have the required parameters, then it can automatically fall into the next configuration within that chain, which would still be within your default configuration here. So you have the ability to create multiple different configurations. And then within any configuration, you can chain together different mappings that allow you to look for data in different incoming fields. So when you look at the parameters that allow you to optimize how that data is going to be accessed, the first one that I want to focus on is return data by status. So if you're going in and you're tuning your address cleansing, by default, it's only going to enrich the record with additional data if the verification status is returned as verified. And for testing purposes, there may be additional reasons why you may want to enrich partially verified, unverified, or ambiguous addresses to make sure that the verification status is being brought back. And in many cases, an ambiguous or partially verified address may be able to extract country or even city or state information from an address and do a partial enrichment. So that is something you'll want to consider as part of your cleansing strategy. And again, that's one of the reasons why you can sometimes chain together multiple different configuration settings to allow you to account for the different verification statuses that will be possibly suggested. So you'll see that you have some optional parameters in here around setting your default country, your licensed countries. It is your responsibility to make sure that you're leveraging the records that you are entitled to access. So for United States data, that's going to be supported for all customers. But for customers that are also leveraging data outside of that region, if your entitlement allows you to support that, you can go in here and you can add additional countries to your license configuration code. If it is not in a licensed country, so if, for example, I was bringing in data from Brazil, if Brazil is not in my licensed country list and I have an address that explicitly says that it's from Brazil, Reltio will not attempt to cleanse that address because it's not in our list here. So be aware of that as part of your configuration. And you can, again, of course, have different configurations to support different countries. And that's, again, where that chaining together may be very relevant.
Hey, Dan.
Yes, please.
Can I ask 2 questions?
Sure, please.
All right. How can we cleanse address for India and China regions? We are using Locate feature, but not satisfied with kind of the result. Countries like India and China. Can you help us with any of that? Is there another option, or is there thinking around that?
Yeah. So a couple of things that I would emphasize is using some of these additional parameters. So you can see in the process here, there's a pre-processing environment, there's enrichment, there's CAS certification, there's verification, geocoding. Using these different parameters and then using primary aliases, using duplicate handling masks. So again, there's definitely some advanced parameters that you see. There's a link down here at the bottom. The first link says Reltio address cleansing parameters. So there's additional details out there where you may be able to tune the cleansing engine for certain regions to get better results. And in some cases, when you get into rural areas, the postal data is just not good enough that you may always get only partially verified addresses or addresses verified only to a locality. And we'll see some definitions that on the next slide of what the level of verification is being returned. But in some cases, you can enhance the results that you get for different countries. And again, this is where chaining together can be beneficial, is when you look at the one configuration could be US, Canada, and France, and you can have a different configuration that looks for country code I in India as well as China, and then being able to use different parameters, different verification status mappings for those different configurations, again, is definitely something that can be done to try and enhance your enrichment in those countries.
Thank you. Can you quickly provide like a real world example where chained cleanse configurations are used?
Yeah, and I think the example we just gave there is where you may want to use different parameters for different regions, and that's going to get into your verification status mapping. You'll see here that the verification status that is assigned to a record is based upon this verification status mapping. If this field is omitted from your cleanse configuration, it will use the locate default mapping, but you have the ability here to, based upon those address verification codes that locate returns, you can set up how that information is going to be scored. And so you'll see here that it's a 4-part result in that address verification code. The first portion tells you the level of verification that locate was able to do, the parsing technique that it was used, whether or not it was able to pre-process that data to produce the results that were expected, whether it was able to find postal code data. And very importantly here, this last number sequence is going to represent the match score, the level of confidence that locate had in the cleansing that was done. And then looking for these, for the first 2 sections, for the verification and the parsing, there's going to be 3 digits. So the first one is going to indicate the verification status. So whether it's verified, partially verified, ambiguous, or so forth. The second digit is going to tell you the level of verification. So 5 is going to be to a delivery point, which is specifically a subunit within a building. If you're in an apartment complex, it could be the apartment number. If you're in an office building, it could be the suite or unit number. In that case, if locate is able to determine that specific delivery point, you will get a V5 or even potentially a P5 if it's able to discern that there is a sub-building designator. Even if it's uncertain about other factors, you could potentially get a level 5 verification indicating that it's identified to a delivery point. 4 is going to be to the premise level, which is basically your rooftop. So it knows that it's going to get delivered to the right building, but within that building, it may or may not have additional details necessary to parse and identify a sub-delivery point. Now, in some cases, that could be because it's just a residential address and it's a single unit dwelling. But in cases where you have an apartment complex, but if an apartment unit is not specifically designated, it will simply indicate that it's to a premise level. Now, if you're using CAS certification, you do have the ability to have parameters that tell you that this is a multi-unit dwelling. And if it is a multi-unit dwelling, but you only have a premise level verification, then that does allow you to identify where you have verification that is potentially not detailed enough for assured delivery. So being able to use things like the Reltio data validation framework to identify record where it has only been verified to a premise level, but if the delivery point verification system indicates that it is a multi-unit building, you can leverage those parameters that are coming back from locate to identify when a subunit designation should have been possible, but is not currently present. You can identify that with the data verification code. And again, if anybody's looking for more specific details, I'd encourage you to post a message into the Reltio community and we'll respond back to you with additional details.
So there are a bunch of questions, but we'll get to those after some of this. If that's fair.
Yeah, if there are questions around the configuration process, I think we can go ahead and take those now, and then we'll get into some testing and examples.
Okay. So does locate consider the change of address in US and return those address parameters after standardization?
Yeah, so the National Change of Address Registry is not currently leveraged by Locate using the Reltio default services. It is exploring the ability of providing those change of address services as part of our platform. It's not yet available. Today, it's only going to cleanse and standardize that address independent of who actually occupies that building, whether it's an individual or an organization. Locate is just going to standardize based upon the building that exists independent of the occupant. So the answer there would be no, it's not going to take into consideration change of address data. It's only going to take into consideration the building unit itself.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, keep those questions coming in. We'll keep addressing them where appropriate, and then certainly we'll wrap it up at the end and come back to address them all. Things to point out is I mentioned the fact that when you're defining those cleanse configurations, Reltio's velocity packs are going to deliver two configurations by default. One that's going to be labeled as default is going to expect all of the information to be concatenated together into a single field called address input. The other common approach is we call other, is where the information is already pre-parsed to the ability that your source data can map it in as address line 1, address line 2, city, state, zip, postal code, whatever information is specifically broken out. If you already have that level of designation, sometimes that's a more accurate way of allowing Locate to find hints as far as being able to parse and identify that address correctly. In situations where you have the address information in a single field, you would leverage that default configuration and just pass all that data into a single parameter. And where you have the ability to break it out, you'll be able to pass that in using an alternate configuration. And again, by default, Reltio is going to chain these two options together. And it's going to check first to see if you have all that information concatenated together into the address input field. And again, that would be a mandatory field in that configuration. So if that field is not populated, it would then fail over to that other configuration where it expects it to be in the individual fields. Again, just showing you here that in the Reltio data model, you have the ability to just copy and paste and put an address in there and run that test where you can see based upon your configuration, whether it's able to break out that data. And again, you'll see an example here where it says 6601 Dorchester number 12. And we were able to parse that out and say, yes, address line 1 should actually be 6601 Dorchester Road, apartment number 12. So that hashtag 12 is indicating an apartment unit. And you'll see it's also going to take that data and put it into a sub-building field. That was apartment 12. If this was an office suite, it may call it suite 12 or unit 12, depending upon the building designation. So again, just emphasizing that there's a wealth of additional information that can be brought back. Things like census indicators, census codes, the sub-building indicators, the latitude, longitude, the ISO codes for your country, zip4 information. Again, all this would be controlled through that mapping process of leveraging those parameters that are available from Locate. And again, many of these fields are going to be pre-mapped as part of your velocity pack. But if you're using an older configuration where they may not have been there, you can certainly go in and extend your existing environment and add those fields. The next option would be leveraging that API directly. And here you can see in the Postman tool, we're just going in and we're leveraging the environment that you're accessing, whether it's your dev, test, prod, whether you're in a European tenant or a US-based tenant, that would control the environment. And then, of course, your specific tenant ID. And then the URL that we're leveraging here is the batch cleanse. And you'll see that there's a link here at the bottom to the Reltio developer page that gives you the Swagger definition of all the parameters that are available to be passed into that API, as well as the expected schema. And in this case, we're passing in that information into an address input field. And on the right-hand side, you can see that it's parsing and enriching it. In this case, we're asking only that the label be returned, but you could certainly allow it to return each of the individual fields, city, state, zip, zip4, as individual return parameters. And again, that's all done via the input here. It's actually a little bit off the screen on this URL, but we'll see some examples of that in the demonstration. The Reltio Integration Hub gives you the ability to have a low-code, no-code environment where you're orchestrating this process through the Reltio Integration Hub interfaces. So the first thing to point out is that the Reltio connector within the Reltio Integration Hub that connects to your tenant has predefined actions for many of the tasks that you would perform within the Reltio Hub. So it would be things like create entity, create relationship, looking for additional data, leveraging certain services. But the address cleansing service is not defined as a pre-built action. So in order to leverage this service, you would leverage what was called a custom action within the Reltio Integration Hub. So you're using the standard Reltio connector, but you're choosing that custom action option. And then you would use a post method, and then you would bring in the URL. In this case, I'm using an environment called GUS sales, and my tenant ID begins with PLX. So you would put that path directly into that custom action path. And then you would also, because you're using a custom action, you would need to define the input and output parameters. So in this case, I would just get a sample schema that I'm going to use for passing that data in. And within the Reltio Integration Hub, I would use JSON to just provide that sample schema, and Reltio will generate the array attributes and values so that you can use that drag and drop low code, no code methodology within the Reltio Integration Hub to source the data from your incoming file into that structure. And likewise, you would take the resulting structure that Reltio returns that data in, and you would import that into your response body so that you can map that data back out to the appropriate place where you want to return that data. We're also going to see an example here where you can use scripting tools. In this case, I'm going to use just a command line tool called bash shell script, and you can use the curl operator where you can pass into, again, that same API, the batch cleanse API. You would provide a header parameter with the Reltio token. And again, in that script example that we'll provide, I will include the sample code that requests a token specific to the Reltio environment and then uses that token, concatenates it back together when calling that data from the address input into that tenant. So again, we'll see an example of that here in a few moments. And the last thing to focus on is just our demonstration. So before we jump into that demonstration, Chris, do we want to address any questions about the process?
Yeah, let's do it. So for default and license country parameter, I see that you have US, and this was going back, United States and CAN and Canada. Is that because the list is trying to mimic all the variations that may appear in my data source?
Yeah, that's correct. So when you're passing data into that country field, if the data that you've mapped in is matching one of those existing fields, then it's going to attempt to use that country in passing that data over to locate. And again, where that becomes important is if you have multiple cleanse configurations that you have chained together and you want to use that country code to basically guide the Reltio cleanser to using a different configuration for different countries, you have the ability to define those there. You can also, of course, that parameter can be leveraging the Reltio reference data management solution to standardize that incoming value. So if you have country codes that are coming in via your ISO numeric, so if you have a country code that is 840, that represents the United States, being able to map that via RDM to US is supported.
Can we somehow in the config as to get back the locate address ID of the locate address reference data against which our address was verified?
I don't think that's supported to my knowledge. That's definitely something where if you post that into the community, I can work with our product management team and find out if that detail is available. But to my knowledge, it's not. The metadata that Locate is using is effectively behind the scenes, and then it presents those results.
Yeah, just go to community.reltio.com and post there. Will this data be persisted in the tenant as I noticed API returns entity URI?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it is going to return a URI, but it is not going to persist the data. So when you're leveraging that batch cleanse API, you're effectively doing similar to an external match. You're allowing that data to come in. Reltio is going to assign a URI to it just for the purposes of logging and tracking within the Reltio platform, but that URI would not be available in your tenant. If you attempt to access that record via the URI that got returned via that batch cleanse, you would not find that record stored within the Reltio platform. So this is just leveraging the API service to take the data outside of Reltio for your needs.
And last question for now, can locate provide the output in English after cleanse the address if the input comes in German or non-English characters?
Yes. So you do have that ability. There are some optional parameters that you can put in there. I don't have that in any of our examples here today, but Locate does support if you're bringing in data in simplified Chinese or traditional Chinese characters, it will attempt to cleanse and standardize that using the same language or same character set that's coming in. But there are some optional parameters where if the metadata is available, it will basically transcode that data into a Latin-based character set if the metadata is supported.
It'd be interesting because we had Locate's CTO on about a year ago to talk about their roadmap. So maybe I'll try to push to get them on again to see what that roadmap looks like.
Sure.
Be a lot of interest, I think. Thanks, Dan.
All right, great. So let's take a look at this. So a couple things, some of those websites that I referred to along the way, the Reltio address cleanser you see here, again, that link was in the slides that will be provided to you. And you can see that being able to configure the tenant, the address cleansing properties via CAS, SERP, understanding those address verification codes, all that is here. It's very well documented. This is a very commonly used service within the Reltio platform, so it's well documented. And we provide some direction to that. I mentioned that locate service directly. In any case where you're maybe cleansing an address and you're not getting the results that you expect from Reltio, you can always go directly to locate, and you can just, again, this website is in those slides that we'll be providing, and you can just put in that data directly and have it pass to locate, and it will attempt to parse and process that record using the default locate parameters. And again, in some cases, you'll get an address that just doesn't cleanse. And sometimes you wonder whether, is it because something is not configured properly, or is it because it's just not a valid address? And going directly to locate allows you to bypass whether it is a configuration option or whether it's just a bad address. You can also sometimes just take that address and send it over to Google. So if you bring in an address here and I right click sometimes and just do a Google search for it, and look on the Google Maps to see whether or not that address is coming back. And that lets you know whether or not it's a configuration issue or whether that address just doesn't exist. So I did mention, again, being able to take that address and put it directly into your Reltio console and being able to run that and seeing those results coming back. And again, you'll see that there's a wealth of additional data that's available that you may or may not be taking advantage of. So things like time zones, transaction codes, MSA codes, all that data is available as part of that configuration. And we can also include this default configuration that we're using in the deliverables here for the community show that you can download. So here you can see, zoom in on that a little bit, this sample here where you're defining a default output mapping where the parameters from locate are being mapped directly into your Reltio data model. And then when you get into the information here, the infos is the individual cleansers that are being defined. So here's my default cleanser, and here's my other cleanser. And again, you saw in the default cleanser in those previous examples, the data was all coming in via address line, address input. And if that data from your original source is coming in via address line 1, address line 2, country, administrative area via your state, province, or city, you can see where the parameters within locate might be administrative area or locality, but in your Reltio tenant, it may be called city, state, province, etc. So being able to map those based upon the data that is available to you as your input, the more data that you can pass into locate, the more likely it is to cleanse and standardize that. And again, in this case, we're using the input mapping specifically for this cleanser, but we're using the output mapping reference that's pointing back to that mapping 1 that was defined in that top section here in the mappings themselves. So this is just helping you understand where you can define that mapping one time in the mapping section and then leverage it multiple times as your output mapping reference. The parameters that we talked about, the verification status, that address verification code coming back from locate, the verification status mapping is using a regular expression. So here, in this case, we're being a little bit loose, but we're going to call verified anything that starts with the letter V followed by a dot, meaning any characters occurring any number of times are going to be classified as V. But if we have an address verification that's partially verified followed by a 2, 3, 4, or 5, if it ends with a 90 or a 100, then we're indicating here that we're still going to call that verified. So even if it's only partially verified according to locate, if locate has a high degree of confidence that it's 90% confident or above, then we're still going to allow that to be classified as verified. So this is where, when you're getting data for other countries, being able to go in there and say, hey, for partially or even unverified addresses, that locate is 100%, or even you can go in here and say 95% confident, we may still want to classify that as verified. And again, based upon that status of your verification mapping, you have the ability to control, is data going to be returned back to my Reltio tenant? So in cases where records are getting partially verified, that information may not be returned to your tenant. So you can either adjust that verification status mapping, or you can just say, you know what, even if Reltio's default configuration says that it's partially verified, I still want to take whatever data is coming back, and then based upon my output mapping, bring that data back in and enrich it. And of course, it will be associated with that Reltio crosswalk that's returned. So whether you're doing this for data that's being persisted within Reltio on a new Reltio crosswalk, or whether you're leveraging that API that's going to return that data, you're controlling whether or not the data will be returned via this return data by status parameter. All right, so based upon that, we're going to go into the Reltio Integration Hub, and we're going to look at that first process. So in this case, we built out a recipe. In this case, I'm just triggering it every 5 minutes. It's going to go out and look for a file. And I've just simply created a parameter here that just says it's called sample addresses 7. We're going to connect to our SFTP server. We're going to grab that file, parse it down, and then loop through each of those records. Now, within Reltio Integration Hub, we do have the ability to optimize the task utilization by using this batch option. So in the case where we're processing through those records, I'm indicating here via options of Reltio Integration Hub that I want to pass 10 records at a time to that Reltio API. So where that becomes important is when you look at your Reltio tenant and your utilization thereof. What I see here, I'm calling that batch cleanse via Postman here. I have 2 addresses, and you'll see that those 2 addresses are both being returned. So from a Reltio entitlement standpoint, this counts as one API call. So that becomes very important if you're processing large volumes of data, is if you pass only one address per API call and you're processing 1 million records, then you'll consume 1 million of your allocated Reltio API calls. But by passing multiple records in a single API call, you're leveraging the Reltio service more efficiently, and it will affect your entitlement and your utilization quotas. So that's going to affect the API quotas here, as well as your ability to leverage your Reltio Integration Hub task quota. So in this case, by batching those records together and sending multiple records via each API call, that counts as one API, but it also only counts as one task within the Reltio Integration Hub. So in this case, you'll see where I have the on-the-fly cleanser for Reltio, and I've mapped in that batch cleanse API. I imported that schema, and it's going to bring in the address input. Here we also brought in the country, and then the output. Here we're bringing in the data from that file, and we're just concatenating everything together. Address line 1 to string, address line 2 to string. And it's important to put the 2S on here, because if one of those fields is null, if it's missing, then the concatenation option here may potentially fail. By using the default toString operation on a null value or a numeric value, it will still concatenate it together as a string to generate that full value. And then you can see in the response body, all the various different fields that could potentially come back are there available. And again, for our demonstration purposes, because we are passing multiple records over in that single API, because we want to be able to look at them in our results here, we are going to loop through those results. And again, this is for demonstration purposes. You could pass those records into a CSV, and you also use the batch process as well. But again, those would be ways that you would optimize your Reltio Integration Hub task utilization. So if I just hit test recipe, you can see that it's going to go pretty quickly here. It's going to go out, get that file, batch those records up, send them over to the Reltio API. And again, by clicking in here, I can see that the input is 7 records of a batch of potentially 10 records. And the output is the records that can get looped through. And you'll see here that all of those addresses are being passed over. And the results are coming back to provide those rich details. In this case, the Milton Street address in Pennsylvania. And again, for demonstration purposes, I've placed them into a list here where you can see what the original data that we were passing over to locate and how locate passed that data back. So again, we'll provide a copy of this recipe that you can import into your instance of Reltio Integration Hub. But the process here, of course, is just connecting to that source data using any of the available connectors. You could be connecting to a SQL database. You could be connecting to an Excel sheet, to a Google Doc, to Box. to any of your variety of different sources. So the Reltio API is going to be accessible, transparent to where that data is actually being sourced. By using the Reltio Integration Hub low-code, no-code environment, you're just mapping that incoming source data into those parameters. And again, you saw that where we were just concatenating those fields together from that inputting file. Whether that input is coming from a CSV file, as we're doing here today, whether it's coming from a SQL database, whether you're connecting to your Salesforce environment, however you choose to get that data, that's passed over to the Reltio cleanser as a previous step within this recipe. So I'll stop
Image.
here for this recipe.
Yeah, good. There are a lot of questions specifically about this. How can the cleanser output for address line 1 be changed? So, for example, to exclude the apartment number and store in the address line 2 output.
Yeah, and that's definitely a question that we get a fair amount. And the short answer is that locate is going to decide via locate's parameters how that data is going to be brought back. So if we go back into our Postman, and right now I've got a select in here where you can see I'm selecting only the label to come back, but by removing that parameter, it's going to return everything back by default. And again, my token is timed out here. I'm going to re-get that token and re-cleanse that data. And you'll see here now we're actually getting all of those various different fields. And you'll see that address line 1 does have that apartment concatenated to it. But if you want to get more granular, by going down to other fields that, such as street, you can see that the street there was Dorchester Road. The street number was 6601. So if I don't want that apartment number to be there, I can simply look at the premise number and the street name independent of that full address line 1. So the delivery address is going to be all that information pre-concatenated. But if you look at those individual fields, and again, we can see this if we go back into the Reltio console where that data was brought out. Here we have 6301 Milton Street, PA. If we use that address, and I'll just type it in. By default, the address line 1 is taking the delivery address. But you can see here that by looking at the premise number and the street name, which is Dorchester Road, by concatenating together only that street name and premise number, you can exclude that apartment building number from that. So it would just allow you to concatenate that data a little bit differently in your mapping. So by default, the mapping back to address line 1 is going to take your delivery address, which has got all those fields pre-concatenated. But by using an alternate mapping, you can control how that data is brought back.
Great. What is the optimal value of batch size here?
Yeah, and that's definitely going to depend upon the size of your records. For addresses, the size is going to be relatively consistent of around probably about 100 characters, which once you format that into a JSON structure is going to be maybe around 100K. So I think the numbers that I've seen is between 50 and 100 is going to be your ideal batch size. So the only negative consequence of doing larger batches is you run the potential for a timeout. So within Reltio Integration Hub, you do have some abilities to set some of those parameters around what is your expected timeout, whether you're running parallel tasks, the performance of your actual Reltio tenant. But the short answer is I would think I would start at around 50. And then if you go up to around 100, you're going to get a little bit better performance, but you need to put more error handling in there. And if I go back into my recipe here, you'll see that Reltio does support the ability to create error handlers. So in this case, by taking those task steps that I was performing below here and dragging that up into that monitor section, it allows me to monitor for errors such as a timeout and to either retry that step or to just choose to log that step as potentially having performed an error. So the idea here is you can go a little bit larger and then account for error handling, or you can use a more conservative number where you're going to get more consistent process.
Great. What is the upper limit of a batch cleansing address in a single payload? Is it size or number of arrays?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be the total size of the record of the payload. So if you have addresses that are very large and complex, if you're passing a lot of information over, then the size of that payload is going to be more restrictive than the number of records itself. So if you can pass 1,000 records and it doesn't exceed the optimal record, the payload size, then Reltio is going to cleanse all 1,000 of those records and send them back in a single task or a single API utilization. So again, it's something where you're going to get a little bit of trial and error. And if you want to post a message to the Reltio community, we can ask for a little bit more specific guidance from our product management team. But it's something you can definitely test out and validate, or you can work with your Reltio customer success team to get more details.
Great. Although we're going to share the recipe with everyone, is the recipe available in the community library?
That's a great question. I can certainly work with Chris to have it shared there.
Not the online community, but the library within.
Oh yeah. So no, by default, I don't think it's in the community library here on the left-hand side.
Yeah.
So we will put it into the Reltio community
Yeah.
as an import a zip file. So you can go into your recipe and lifecycle management, and there will be a package. We'll give you the ability to import that package into a new folder, and you'll be able to get that zip that you can download as part of the receivables that you have.
And I'll send that in an email tomorrow. What order does the cleanser work? So we also have noticed noise words. Sorry.
Noise words. So absolutely. So yeah, the Reltio cleanser is going to occur before matching takes place. If you're matching on address information, which is very likely to be the case, the Reltio cleanser is definitely going to be applied before any of the matching is done. You can have multiple sequences that the order in which the cleansing is done, again, whether you're bringing that data in via the address input, whether you're using parameters like the country codes to determine which data is being processed. Again, I think that was in our top example here, where we had that locate default country. So here, we're only going to process records from United States, Canada, and France. But in this second one here, because we do not have that country code passed, it will attempt to cleanse all addresses via this cleanse configuration. Whereas if you wanted a specific cleanse configuration for US, Canada, and France that uses this classification for verified, but for Dominican Republic, you wanted to use a more stringent verification mapping, then you could simply set that up as an additional option here. You could just come in here and copy that section, put a comma, add a new one in, and then we could bring that in for Dominican Republic. And in that case, I may take some of these other options here, and I may move those into the partially verified category. So therefore, only an address verification code beginning with V for Dominican Republic would be considered verified. Any other configurations that match these parameters now would only become partially verified for Dominican Republic addresses.
Thanks, Dan. That's all the questions for now.
Great. So let's move on to that last thing. I know we're running low on time, but in the scripting options here, so you can see I have a script. It's just called addresscleanse.sh. And when I run that file, it's just going to echo those addresses back, and then it's going to say I'm done. So if we go out and we look at that script itself, here you can see the results. My computer has detected that the data has changed. So I can reload that, and here's that data that just came back. And if I ask my editor to parse it out, you can see that it's parsing out that address using that same information. Note here with the address, reference data management is determining what the ISO 2, ISO 3, and isonumeric, even though locate will be returning that data as well. Here you can see that data is coming back from RDM. But the script itself, again, I mentioned, and I'll see if I can increase the size here. So the first thing I'll notice is that this is not my actual password. So you can, in this script, you can provide your username and password. It's going to leverage the Reltio authentication service. And you can see a sample payload of what an access token might look like. And Reltio is now using the JWT token. So they're a little bit longer. But then again, I'm not super efficient with my shell script. So I'm using actually a couple of iterations of parsing to get that JWT token from that authorization API to break it down so that when I call that batch cleanse API here, you can see I'm calling the cleanse and I'm just passing the authorization bearer as that access token that came from above. So you can see here, I'm just getting, in this case, I'm reading the data from a file called data.csv. And we can see that here's that data that's coming in. In this case, we're parsing out the file header and we're just going to ignore it. We're going to bring all that address line data that's coming from that file. And we're just going to bring it into that payload. We're echoing that address, which you saw coming onto the screen there at the top. And then we're just passing it over to that cleanse service. And if we scroll way to the right here, you'll see we're just appending the data into that result.json. So in this case, our scripting file is not making any effort to parse out the specific results. It's just taking the entire results JSON that was returned by Reltio and it's appending it into this file. So we can see that those 3 address returns are just being returned as JSON. But if you get a little bit more sophisticated in your script here, you can parse out that data that's being returned from Reltio. So in this case, instead of bringing that data into results.json, you could parse it out using something like awk, which is another command line utility. So for those of you that are very script savvy, you can get more sophisticated. For those of you who are less script savvy, you can just take this example that we're providing here. You can put in your own credentials. And again, typically we would recommend that you leverage a service account. So within your security for that service account that's going to be accessing this, you need a minimum of create and update permissions on the entity type where that cleanse is being deployed. In this case, we're leveraging the default cleanser on the location object. So the user credentials that I have need to have a minimum of create and update permissions on the location entity, but it does not need to have any additional parameters. In the cases where you're doing a service account, rather than using the base location object, if you created an alternate object that would be used by your cleansing service APIs, then you can restrict the parameters so that service account is not able to perform other actions within Reltio, but is just able to access that cleansing service. So I know we're towards the end of the time. We'll take a few more questions and then we'll respond to any additional ones through the community.
Can we reverse the order if possible to custom cleansers? Is back to the other question that Brian had.
Yeah, so within the Reltio matcher, the short answer is no. So the Reltio cleansers are going to be applied before matching. So when I define my match rules, if my match rules are using a cleanser here, any cleanser, so if you're using a noise word cleanser or a word replacement cleanser as part of your matching rule, the Reltio address cleanser would be applied first in creating that record. So if we go and look at a record within this hub, so as this data is brought into the system, in this case, you can see that the data, so this matching here that you're referring to, this would only be relevant for data that's being loaded and persisted within Reltio. The processes that we've talked about today are just bouncing data off of the Reltio cleansing service via either Reltio Integration Hub, Postman, or the batch shell script. But for data that's being physically persisted in Reltio, here I have data that's originating from Salesforce, and that Reltio cleanser is appending this data. So these cleansed values would be applied first. And then within your match rule, any noise words or exclusions within the match rule would then be applied second as part of the matching process.
Great, Dan. That was amazing. So thank you so much for providing this information. Look, we have another one next week and you're going to be at, so we're excited about that one. But thank you everyone for coming. So please, at the end, take the survey. Your feedback is helpful. We have one of these every week around specific topics. So if you go to community.reltio.com and go to upcoming events, at the top events, you'll see all the events coming up. And this is recorded, and I will be sending this out early tomorrow. It should be in your inbox. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for attending today's session. And Dan, wow, awesome as usual. So thank you. A lot
Thanks,
of feedback already saying thanks. It's great.
Appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, we do. All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Cheers.